All right, this is the first video lecture in the unit entitled Revolutions in Russia and Asia. And this particular one is about revolutions in Russia. We're going to start off with this incredibly accurate reproduction of what Alexander III looked like. You might think you've seen him as you enter a restroom, but you would be mistaken. This is actually exactly what he looks like. All right, in this unit, we're going to take a step back chronologically because we already went through World War I in the last unit, and we're going to step back before the ending of World War I and look at how did Russia get to the point where their new government completely took over and they just stepped back from World War I and didn't participate all the way to the end. So this is Alexander III. He's the Tsar near the end. During World War I, World War I breaks out. And there's a couple of things going on in Alexander III's Russia that caused some discontent with people that are living there. So there he is up close. All right, the first thing is political prisoners. If you're familiar with Siberia, you see that's located here. It's very close to the North Pole. It's very, very cold. And so this was a popular work camp site that individuals were sent when they became enemies of the state. And they were worked to death in these concentration camps in Siberia if they weren't killed flat out. And there's a couple of things that could have caused you to become a political prisoner in Alexander III's Russia. Thing one is anyone who questioned the authority of the Tsar could find themselves in a Siberian concentration camp. It's possible. Reason number two, anyone who worshipped outside of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was the official religion of Russia, could find themselves exiled in a prisoner of war camp in Siberia. Right? The Russian Orthodox, if you're not familiar, is a split off of Christianity after the fall of Rome. The two halves of the Christian church couldn't get along, so once the western part split and became Catholicism, the eastern part split and became Orthodox. So this is the Russian version of that. Third reason, speaking a language other than Russian could get you thrown into a concentration camp or a prisoner of war camp in Siberia. So all of these were things that seemed as they came across, at least in the eyes of the government, as being anti-Russian, anti-nationalistic, and could get you in a lot of trouble. Also, it just helps us maybe appreciate the freedoms that we have in the country here and how precious it is for us to preserve those individual freedoms and differences among us as a component of a democratic society. All right, well, in this chaos, a couple of other things first. There were people within society that were persecuted other than political prisoners. Like Jews, for instance, really had it difficult in Russia. They got a lot of persecution. So this is an artist's rendering of some local Russians welcoming Jews to the neighborhood. That's sarcasm. And if we go into our vocab section there, vocab word one, pogrom, this was organized violence against Jewish people. So these sort of things were going on. Obviously, that didn't work very well for the Jews and other people who were probably just afraid and thankful that the government wasn't focusing on them. These all contributed to just discontent in Russian society. All right, the workers in Russia seriously exploited some common characteristics. This doesn't answer a question, but some common characteristics of laborers in Russia led to the ideas of this guy. It's actually not Santa Claus. I know I've been hinting at it with like close to the North Pole, but this is a different guy. This is Karl Marx. He is the author of socialism, a big promoter of socialism, and this belief system really resonated with a lot of Russian workers, right? Because he claimed that workers should overthrow the government. They should literally turn society upside down, and the workers should be in charge, and there should be no classes within society. So a couple of terms he used, like for instance, he used this term proletariat, which is his term for the working class. These are the people that should be doing the rising up against the evil bourgeois capitalists. And so this was part of the verbiage of Karl Marx's manifesto. All right, this resounded in Russia. It's not just Russia that his ideas were introduced, but in Russia they found a home under the leadership of this guy right here. This is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known as Lenin. Feel free to just refer to him as Lenin. But he is an individual who embraced socialism and kind of started the Communist Party in Russia. It was known as the Bolshevik Party. Just be careful who you say that to. All right, on your note sheet, question 4 is actually a repeat. We're going to pick that up a little bit later, so you can cross it off or leave it blank. But question 4, we're going to take that out of the contention here. We're going to keep the numbers the same, though, so the next one will still stay 5. All right, as Alexander was done, and the next czar who came to power was Nicholas II, and he extended the policy, I guess, of czars doing things that upset their people. And so a couple of instances of that during his reign is the Russians, which is this chunk of territory up here, went to war with this country right here, which is Japan, which in the early 1900s, Russia was this major Western power, industrialized nation, and Japan was kind of like almost one step above a colony. So this should have been a pretty one-sided victory, but the Japanese actually won this war. So that really caused some conflict there as well. So for the purpose of the question, the loss during what conflict caused more anger toward the Tsar? It was called, as it says up here, the Russo-Japanese War. Fought between Russia and Japan, where Russia should have won in theory, but the Japanese defeated the Russians, and so this was a major upset. Made the Russian people really upset. First of all, they didn't want to fight the war, and then they got beat by who they thought was an inferior enemy, and that just made the Tsar look even worse. A little bit later, a group of protesters, peaceful protesters, decided to march outside the winter home of the Tsar and just peacefully protest their conditions and things like that, and that led to another incident. This one was called Bloody Sunday because the Tsar's response to this peaceful protest was to tell his troops, go out there and shoot those people. So similarly to how like the Boston Massacre sort of contributed to the American Revolution as one of the stepping stones, this incident is going to contribute to the overthrow of the Russian government, where these peaceful protesters outside the winter home of the Tsar were fired on by Russian soldiers. All right, so this left a bad taste in Russians' mouths. You add all these other things that are going on that also contribute to the discontent, and things are getting close to a boiling point in Russia. All right, the next thing that happens is over time, the war is going poorly. The conditions aren't getting any better, and another organization, another march is started. This time it was by female factory workers, and they started marching on the capital, the Tsar's capital, and as they were getting closer, they were getting more and more people joining them. Soldiers even joined them, and this became known as the March Revolution. And this was a more successful protest because it actually resulted in the people going into the Tsar's house and putting him under house arrest. You can see them taking out artifacts in this picture here. So it's called the March Revolution. Its ultimate accomplishment is that it caused the Tsar to be removed from power. He stepped down, and this mob basically put him and his family on house arrest. So no Tsar, but the family is on house arrest. They aren't executed or anything. They're just confined to their house and monitored constantly. All right, so what this means is that it left no government in charge of Russia. The Tsar is gone. There's nothing to replace it. So there was a momentary period where it was like a power vacuum. And how is that going to be filled? So the solution was to come up with this thing called the provisional government, And for our definition purposes, this is essentially the temporary government after the fall of the Tsar. Temporary government after the fall of the Tsar. So that's kind of what provisional means. So that definition makes a lot of sense. All right, the leader of the provisional government. I love showing this picture because it's an interesting looking individual. This guy is the leader of the provisional government. His name is Alexander Kerensky. So he's the figurehead, the leader in this in-between time. All right, also, in Russian society, there's still the Communist Party that's gaining more and more popularity. You had Lenin, who was the face of the political party. He's the one speaking out to crowds and kissing babies and things like that, what politicians do. And then on the flip side, the communists are actually gathering an army too. And the guy who's in charge of the communist army under Lenin is this guy right here. His name is Leo Trotsky. He actually does not have a 10 tattooed on his face. That's just for note purposes. But Trotsky is the leader of the soldiers. Lenin's the figurehead in front, getting people excited and riling up crowds against the new provisional government. And eventually, they are able to rise up and overthrow the provisional government. And we saw when we did World War I that when that change happened, the communists ended Russia's involvement in World War I, and they negotiated a special separate treaty with the Germans, and they became a totally new nation. They also renamed the country, didn't call it Russia anymore. They referred to it as the United Soviet Socialist Republics, which is shortened to USSR. And so that kind of marked the complete takeover of the Russian government from the Tsar to this communist government. Also, if you've ever seen the play or the movie Anastasia, Anastasia is the perspective on this story from the Tsar's perspective. You don't see that too often because Anastasia was the daughter of the Tsar, and they were put on house arrest, and then eventually Lenin had them executed when he took over power. And the whole story of Anastasia is that supposedly the daughter escaped, even though she probably everybody thought she was dead. And so after time, several individuals claimed that they were the Tsar's daughter, and Anastasia, and so there's a bit of controversy about it. So if you've seen that story or you know of that story, it's the same event, not from the workers' perspective, but from the Tsar and the Tsar's family's perspective.